The title of my talk is User-Centric Design, What Spatial Cognition Can Add. I have a PhD in architecture from the Space Syntax Group. And then I've spent many years at the Chair of Cognitive Science at ETH Zurich. And I also have my own consultancy. And this is the outline of today's talk. I'm going to start to talk a little bit about user-centric design and what I think spatial cognition can add to that. And this was an image that I'm sure most of you know. It's from Gordon Cullen's Townscape, 1961, and it really exemplifies why I pursue this line of research, which is there are many architects who design urban townscapes, spaces from bird's eye perspective and care a lot about what it looks like from the top down. And what I'm really passionate about is how people experience the spaces from the egocentric perspective when they're walking around the space. And this is a diagram that is the backbone of most of my research. And the reason why I like it is because whereas in architecture school, many students are taught that the architect designs the built environment, and there's that kind of relationship between man and environment. This diagram posits the user as equally as important. So there's a third bubble. So it's the architect, the built environment, and the user. So as an architect, you anticipate what the user does. The user uses the built environment, and the architect designs it. And having this constant feedback between, as an architect or planner designing a space, how does a user feed into it? This is represented by the two arrows at the center of the screen. I call this the design analysis feedback loop. That's something that I think is really essential to advocate in architecture school and at the workplace. So I'm not alone in advocating this kind of approach. And I'm grateful to everyone who's influenced me so far. I've published on my idea of, the kind of toolkits of methods that are relevant. I've used the terms evidence-based design methods often. And these are two articles that might be helpful to go back to. I'm part of the I'm part of the cognitive science group at ETH Zurich. So Professor Christoph Hölscher is the professor of cognitive science. He's a psychologist by training. And there are at least two sections of the cognitive science group. One of them is about how we deal with space, how we experience space. So it's like applied spatial cognition. And these are some of the activities and research and teachings topics that we address. And I've included a few slides on spatial cognition itself in case it's relevant for people listening. So what is spatial cognition? It's a branch of cognitive psychology. And I really like this definition, which comes from the Handbook of Spatial Cognition by Waller and Nadel, which is spatial cognition studies how people acquire and use knowledge about their environment to determine where they are, how to obtain resources, and how to find their way home. So there are different definitions of spatial cognition, but this is one I like. And there are several resources that people might want to turn to, such as these handbooks. There are several journals where spatial cognition fits in particular this one that has spatial cognition in the title. There are two main conferences that really target spatial cognition itself, although spatial cognition is also a part of many other conferences. So for example, the one that was held in Dublin this year came out of a collaboration between German and American researchers, and the one that was held in Rome is mainly Italian researchers organizing that. And I really like this network. It's a website. It groups together resources. It brings together people. Many of these spatial tests that researchers use in their work, they're available there. Also, how to score tests like the Santa Barbara Sense of Direction test, they're all there. So I think this is a really helpful resource. And so I am part of this, body of literature that is looking at the intersection of spatial cognition and architectural design. And these are some of the special issues of journals that are quite important, I feel, starting off with The Environment and Behavior from 2003 that has lots of really great articles. There was a workshop held in 2006, Space Syntax and Spatial Cognition, and the Planning and Design special issue from 2012 is also fantastic if anyone wants to read that. And I was lucky enough to contribute to this trend also with colleagues from the Bartlett. And I've been part of various teaching initiatives that use space syntax and spatial cognition in architectural design. Not all of those have been focused at the urban scale, but my talk today is going to be focused at the urban scale. We've also tried quite extensively to include space syntax and user-centric design in bona fide design studios, urban design studios, and building scale design studios. Such as this, we did a research project on informal learning spaces that also had a teaching initiative. So the thoughts and ideas can be applied at building scale also. Yeah, so my first big theme today is getting lost in cities. What can spatial cognition add in terms of user-centric design? So this study was part of my PhD. And what I did is I took photographs of street corners from the City of London. And I asked people initially, which way would you go? Which is like an open navigational question. And then which way would you go to find a taxi rank? And the idea behind the taxi rank question was to get them to focus on something that is spatially defined. So you would find a taxi rank on a street that is more connected, but it's visually neutral because I was recording where participants were looking using an eye tracker. And, in this photograph, if you think about which street do you think is more connected, most people said right because it's wider and more open and it seems more inviting, whereas the actual answer was left because that thoroughfare right at the end, that backs at the end of the left path alternative is actually a major street. So that one ends up being more connected. And I showed people 28 stimuli. I had 15 participants. Each photograph showed a street corner of the City of London where there's one clear left path alternative and one clear right path alternative. So I'm only looking at this, at the case of two path alternatives. And I showed participants the stimuli mirrored on the vertical axis to control for left-right bias. And what I looked at were people choosing the path segment that was more connected? So I came up with a measure of, the more connected path segment. And what I found was that people were, when I looked at global integration, people were in fact choosing the more connected street for some reason. So you can ask people decisions in spatial cognition and analyze them and analyze that kind of data. I also collected the eye tracking data. So this is the slide showing all of the fixations for all of the participants for this one image. And the first observation is that there aren't a lot of data points. And the second observation is that, there are kind of clusters of fixations. So fixations are moments in the eye movement when we are said to, pick up and process information. So if you look at the y-axis, there's a cluster around the horizon point. And if you look at the x-axis, there are two peaks that loosely correspond to the place where the two path segments end up. And this is another visualization of the same data. So the way that you visualize the data is also quite important. And I went on to one step further, and I thought, isn't it interesting that people are looking at very specific areas, and could you maybe use this kind of spatial geometric analysis to predict where people are going to look when they're navigating around spaces? So urban areas where they're not familiar with the area. And I came up with this concept of choice zones, which is a spatially geometric defined area defined by how far you can see, so the longest line of sight and the skyline. And, you know, this could be one way in which we could predict where people look when they're navigating around cities. And I went on to do a follow-up study out of doors using mobile eye tracking study. So in this case, also the participants were not familiar with the area, and I was recording where they were looking. So all of these studies so far are to say that, sure, you can ask people what they're thinking when they're navigating cities. That's one way of collecting data. You can also record where they look. We were also fortunate enough to do an fMRI study where we actually collected the brain data of, you know, brain activation whilst participants were doing a navigation study. And we were fortunate to find that when participants turned onto a street that was more connected, there was firing in a part of the brain known as the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that is said to be responsible for navigation, also other things such as spatial memory and memory more generally. So this was a study I did together with Hugo Spears's group at UCL. And I'm not going to go into too much specifics about the study in this presentation, because my general point is not particular to this study, but this is the image that shows the area of London, so Soho, in which participants were highly trained. So they had to, in this study, they had to really know the area inside out. The numbers in red are the locations of all the landmarks they had to know, and there were 6 routes marked in green. And then they were shown a video in the fMRI scanner in which they had to make navigational decisions. And I'll show you a snippet of the video in due course. And this graphic is showing the axonometry of Soho in the main diagram. And we've illustrated one route. So this is one route that participants were taking. And the route is colored according to connectivity. So in maths, this is called degree centrality. In space syntax, we call it connectivity. And the colors represent changes in the path segment connectivity. So it starts off red, and then the subsequent segment is less connected, so it goes down to orange, and then this segment is again less connected, so it goes to yellow, and then the connectivity increases at the end, so the route color changes back to orange. And if you look at this graph here, which is degree centrality, you can see it starts at 0 and it goes down, down, up. And we found the same pattern in the activation of the hippocampus, so down, down, up. And we found that only for the condition when participants were navigating, and not when they were just watching a video and did not have to make any navigational decisions. And this is what the fMRI scanner looks like. And I'm going to show you just a snippet of the kind of footage that participants were looking at. And you can refer to this video also online. Yeah, so I've shown you some examples of eye tracking. I showed you an example with the fMRI scanner. You can also use these kind of ideas, you know, real world projects. So I was really fortunate to work with the City Planning Office of Amsterdam on a bridge project. We'd also studied Amsterdam as part of a teaching project, and they wanted to have a little bit more space syntax input, which is why I was involved. And it's about the Kopf Java bridge, which is positioned here. And yeah, so I did some, you know, basic space syntax network analyses for them, and I showed them that with the addition of the new bridge, if you can see my mouse here, the central station, which is here, and the main living quarters, which are north of the river, would be well integrated. So this is the status quo, and I'm going to flip to the proposal. So with the bridge, and you can see that this is step depth from the central station. This shows that the living quarters here are well connected to the central station. And I can't finish talking about this project without adding that the way that you use the kind of methods and diagrams that are produced as part of these methods, and space syntax in particular, is really important. For example, the really colorful network diagrams that I was teaching my students as part of the teaching initiative to use, they didn't mean anything to them. And they were adamant that the only way they could incorporate the analysis into their design projects was if it was like this, if it was monochrome. So here we have what the students ended up using and ended up being valuable for them. So I have a few minutes left, so I wanted to talk a little bit about another project, which is about urban density and whether urban density is a factor of crowdedness. So I had a project in a few different parts. The first part was, how do people rate perceived urban density? And I used photographs. And I used photographs without people in them in this pilot study, and I asked them to rate which location is more dense, and I came up with space geometric ways of analyzing the results. And the findings were that visibility, so how far you can see, was really important for deciding how dense participants rated the photographs. And all these four factors together were the most important. So visibility, how far you could see, the amount of green, the number of buildings, and the building height. However, a big factor of perceived urban density is people, whether people are there or not, and I had specifically excluded them in the pictures that I included in that I had in that pilot study. So I went on to really target this issue. How important is presence of people for our definition of urban density? So I chose an area of Zurich that's been newly designed. It's right next to the main station, and so it has a fluctuation of people at rush hour. It's full of people, and then that dies down in off-peak hours. And we actually created our own virtual model of this area because there wasn't one, and that's something I also wanted to offer in this lecture. And what participants did is they navigated through the virtual model and they rated which location is more dense. And sometimes there were people there, and there was a condition with people, and there was a condition without people. And this video is just illustrating, what the model looked like. It's not the actual footage that participants saw. And we're really proud of the model. It took forever to build. We populated the model with agents simulating crowds. Sometimes they do funny things. The developers of the area actually offered us a model that would have had photographic qualities to them, but which would have been really nice to, import the photographic textures into this model. But it was so difficult to, get to work with their model that worked for their purposes, but wasn't enough for ours, that we ended up making our own complete model from scratch. And it doesn't have photographic textures, but it worked really well also for the experimental design. And we repeated the experiment, like for like, from the virtual rail study to the real world study. And using the same area of town, the same route. We had participants rating the same locations, and we find the same findings in both cases. People rate areas as more dense when there are more people in it. Yeah. So I'm almost on time. I just had a few conclusions. I really believe that, user-centric designs is super important. I think we should spend more time teaching it at architecture school. It should have more space in the workplace. This evidence-based toolkit of methods is helpful. And I think that this design analysis feedback loop, it's not particularly efficient at the moment with different softwares having to be used and import export of files. It's not just like a right click in your CAD program and you say analyze this in terms of you know, the user experience. So I think that still has to be optimized, and nevertheless, I think it has value. So thanks very much.